Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. On today's episode, I have a very thoughtful conversation with the architectural historian, curator, writer, and teacher Sean Anderson. Sean recently became the director of the B.Arch program at Cornell, where he's also an associate professor. But before this, he was the associate curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA. While at MoMA, Sean co-organized Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America with Mabel O. which opened last year to rave reviews. He also co-curated Tracing Displacement and Shelter in 2016 and Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age in 2017. Sean has undergraduate degrees in both architecture and architectural history and completed his PhD in African art history, and this is where we begin this conversation. I was curious about Sean's interest in both architecture and history and how he saw these things fitting together. We talk about the overlap of theory and practice and his own continual desire to design buildings. We also talk about moving into curation and his sort of critical project while he was at MoMA that culminated in many ways in the Reconstruction show. I really appreciated Sean's honesty here in talking about that show and talking about the work he did at MoMA and applaud that work that he did during his tenure there and continues to do in different ways now that he's back in academia at Cornell. This is a great conversation that touches on so many different topics that are of interest to me and this show, and I assume many of you. And so I'm pretty sure you will enjoy this one as much as I did. If you like Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. They give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, if you want to see more of it in the world this year, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details to sign up and to help support the show. Thank you, as always, for your support. And here is my conversation with Sean Anderson. I want to start this conversation going all the way back to the beginning of your education because you have a degree in architecture and the history of architecture that you got at the same time. Is that right?
That's correct. I was the first person at Cornell to attempt such a feat, and it happened a little bit later in the 5 years in which I had to keep petitioning to be able to take more classes than were required. And in fact, I got the support finally by one of the professors in the history department to to do the 2 degrees at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was extremely fortunate at a moment when I had the likes of Mark Yarzenbeck and Chris Otto and Mary Woods all there at the same time to think about the history of architecture and its relationship to architecture design as well.
So I have 2 questions about that that may or may not be related. I'm kind of interested, A, in why you were interested in both of those things, or why you wanted to kind of pursue, the double major, and then B, which again may or may not be related. When you were in school, and I realize it's kind of hard to go back and kind of think about intentions or motives, were you interested in being an architect? Did you want to design buildings and build buildings, or was there something about this history that you were kind of feeling maybe my way in here is somewhere else?
I have always wanted to build buildings, and that I think that idea or that provocation never goes away. It's something that I think about quite often. In fact, that history and theories of history and so forth are a lens or a window through which to understand how one builds and how one thinks about the world in which one builds and designs. So I would say that throughout my undergraduate and graduate degrees, I had every intention to be an architect, but I didn't necessarily know what that might look like. I knew that
Mm,
maybe working in a corporate office wasn't the way to go, but I also wasn't sure at that moment, at least in my naive undergraduate years, um, what other possibilities there might be. And
mm,
when I discovered the work of Diller Scofidio, when it
mm,
was just two names, that was in my second year, I would say. I immediately found, in a way, the kinds of architecture or the kinds of practices, I would say, that I was most interested in emulating. And
mm.
this was also a moment in which Hayduk was still quite central
Right.
to architectural thinking, and even the likes of the New York Five, they
Mm,
kind of were present. I certainly they were present within the curriculum at Cornell in their own way, and but I wasn't sure ever, like, how to be an architect that makes buildings that are also critical, or that
you're right,
are
right.
that embrace questions of history as we understood them.
It's really interesting to hear you say this because I feel the same way. We were talking a little bit before recording about my background. That's kind of how I always felt about graphic design. Also, is that I was really interested in these sort of alternative design practices, but couldn't really kind of figure out how to do that in a new way, or in a kind of smart way. I guess I'm kind of interested in why that was interesting to you, or why you wanted to build buildings, you wanted to design buildings, but you also wanted them to be critical. Where did that sort of criticality come from, that interest in history, that kind of being a part of the discussion, and not just, building high rises or apartment buildings, or kind of,
Sure.
corporate headquarters or something like that?
Uh, well, and I think that's exactly where history dovetails with ideas of practice, or ideas of how practices can inform larger questions about the world, or about the ways in which people see the world. And I would say that, I had had a long background in theater, and it
Mm.
sounds, beyond just the high school musical, but I went to an arts high school,
Oh.
and we were very much uh, we were very much part of an ecosystem that allowed for us to take creative writing courses and sculpture courses and jewelry making and metalsmithing courses
Mm,
and theater and singing and so forth. And I think that period, I was so fortunate to be a part of this school, especially because it's in South Carolina. It's called the Fine Arts Center. It still exists.
mm,
It's a very important moment, I think, for me at that time, at least unconsciously, that one could uh, intersect with many art forms, many art
mm,
practices, and also begin to create a body of work, and work in realms that may not have been comfortable, or may not have been exactly the practice that we are taught to do. So I worked in theater quite extensively, and I worked in theater throughout my undergraduate years, extensively
mm.
writing, producing, directing, being an actor on the main stage of Cornell
Wow.
Theater. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I think all of these aspects came together in one way or another. Again, by looking at the practice of Diller and Scofidio, I don't want to
Mhm,
to focus on them necessarily, but what I saw in their work was the capacity and the potential to create performative spaces, ideas,
Mm.
narratives through
Hmm.
architecture. And by extension, then that architecture speaking to uh, ideas of how we occupy space or visualize space. Now, the kind of the opposite side of that would be then looking at history very critically, or histories rather, critically. And I would have to say that a number of the courses that I was taking at the time around histories of theory, around,
Mm.
even the German Baroque,
Mm.
started to at least suggest to me that the performativity of architecture and our performance within architecture uh, challenges the very kind of more pragmatic ideas of how we design or how we build. And I had professors who were very much indebted to Corbusian models, and you could find these lineages through Corbusier, but I wasn't really interested in Corbusier at the
Right.
time. And I went to the AA in London at a moment also of great transition for the school. And it was there, I have to say, that I finally saw the breadth of what architecture could be and what architecture could
Mm.
speak to. And when I returned to Cornell from the AA, I kind of made it my mission to challenge the paradigms that had been taught to me at that moment.
I'm interested in this sort of deep dive into the history and the theory. And you ultimately went to get a PhD in art history. You spent time in Rome with the Rome Prize. Like you like really dove into to the sort of writing and criticism and theory and history side of this. And I guess the question that I'm struggling to ask is, were you doing this thinking this is influencing how I design? Or at this point, were you thinking, you know, I am a writer, I am a theorist, or was it even like a this is another type of architecture, that to be a theorist is a type of practice, or to be a curator, we could, talk about your time at MoMA in a second too.
Sure.
Was that maybe an alternative practice for you? Or like how did you kind of think about that in this sort of, or did you even see it maybe as a kind of curve into historian or theorist? Do you know what I mean?
No,
That was like a very convoluted question.
absolutely. I appreciate these questions because they're requiring me to kind of retrace my steps in many
Mm.
ways.
Hmm.
What I would say is that by the time I started a PhD, I hadn't abandoned the notion that I would build, but I had really come to a kind of idea that there was so much more that to learn, that there was so much more to see, there was so much more to think about, and that sounds rather, grand, as it were. But I had left India. I had been practicing as an architect in India, in Ahmedabad, while teaching at the same time, teaching history, ironically enough. Um, and I knew that in the transition to a PhD program, and again, perhaps naively so, that I could potentially practice and do a PhD at the same time. And that was made abundantly clear that that was impossible at the time for me, and when I started the PhD program. But I've always kind of retained this idea that I would love to collaborate with architects, and I have. I started my own office in Sri Lanka when I
Mm.
was teaching in Australia. Um, so I coming back now to the academic world, I have to say, like, the desire to design again and to make things again is ever present for me.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
but I would say that to your point, I would say that I had always imagined that histories, that writing, that curation, that design, and or making were all simultaneous for me, that they shouldn't be read
Hmm.
as separate, they shouldn't be considered as separate, that they inform each other in various ways. And to that end, I would say I also would get in trouble when I started applying for academic positions uh,
Right.
soon after completing the PhD, because I would apply for design and history positions, right?
Mm.
And when I would be in interviews for the design positions, they often, more often than not, the interviews would devolve around this question of history versus design. And they would say, well,
Right.
you have a PhD in history, in art history. You can't be a designer. And I would say, why not? Uh,
Yeah.
and I would get the same on the other side. I would be in
Right.
history interviews, and they would say, "Well, no, you have an M.Arch, so you're a designer."
Right.
I still run into this. I still run into this idea that somehow these degrees that I have, these interests that I have, preclude an ability
Hmm.
to make, or preclude an ability to write and build, or and I say
Hmm.
it to students all the time now, which is you can do it all,
Right.
and you should
Right.
do it all.
Right. I mean, this is it's so funny and also like strangely encouraging to hear you say this, that you're still kind of wrestling with this, because I mean, we're very similar in this regard, in that I feel the same way, that I'm not like really I'm like a fake historian, but I am a writer, and I get, writing is a big part of my practice, but I also still very much identify as a designer, and to start to carry these different positions make your own self definitions and the way potential employers look at you much harder to understand. I just talked to Esther Choi about this a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah.
um
Esther is a great example of
because
this. Yeah,
yeah, and I've talked to many graphic design graduate students who finish an MFA or an MGD program and are like, I feel like I'm less employable now because I've just spent the last 2 years doing all this like weird stuff, where before I was just like, making logos or, designing books.
yeah.
And so for me, I found that teaching has been a way that I can kind of hold all of these together. And I
Mhm.
think of designing a syllabus, both like the actual visual design of the syllabus, but also the structure of the class
Yeah.
and the way the class is organized as a type of design process. And then I'm bringing in the writing and the thinking and the theory there. You worked in academia for a while,
Mhm.
and then you were at MoMA, and I always think curating. I've done very little curating, but it's a space I'm deeply interested in, because that also seems like a way to be both a sort of maker and theorist at the same time. How did you kind of think about this as you've moved from teaching into MoMA?
Mhm.
Was this a way to start to kind of bring these together in a clearer way for you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I had reached a point in Sydney where not only was I dissatisfied with uh, the ways in which we were trying to communicate ideas, or I was trying to communicate ideas around architecture there,
Mm.
in a at that moment, right, in a quote unquote global sense.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I felt very much almost claustrophobic in the administrative role that I had, because I was reshaping the curriculum um, that had been around for decades around this question of artistic or spatial practice as it
Mm.
related to architecture. in its broadest sense. And it it set up a whole new paradigm, not only for what I felt like was a moribund kind of design ideas, but also I think it also challenged what for Sydney and what for Australian architects had been for so long focused on you go to architecture school in order to build, right?
Mm,
And then any other things
hmm.
that you might do are separate from that. So
Right.
um, I applied to MoMA by accident, I would say. Not, and I say that kind of off the cuff because I was applying for academic roles and I saw the position advertised, and I had less than a day to put together my materials. And,
Wow.
you know, I did so and I hit send, not thinking anything of it really. And so I was very shocked when I got the first interview and so forth. To fast forward a bit, in fact, what I realized upon arrival at MoMA was that this was probably the first time in my professional life in which all of the ideas, all of the questions that I had been thinking about and trying to approach in various ways previously came together. And it
Mm,
was an incredibly joyous moment for me. It was incredibly um, validating and personally, and also that in the space of curation, one could, in effect, build, design, ask
mm,
questions, perform, all of these
hmm.
ideas that I had
Right.
been, involved in suddenly were present and were possible.
Had you done much curating before? Had you kind of organized any shows or exhibitions before this?
Not in architecture.
Oh, okay.
Not in architecture, ironically. When I was a PhD student at UCLA, I worked in the Fowler Museum. Again, a kind of
Mm,
serendipitous moment in which I had long been interested in the work of a scholar named Pratapaditya Pal, who is the first Indian born, Calcutta born scholar of Tibetan art. And he
mm,
is perhaps still considered the preeminent scholar of Tibetan art, although he has never been to Tibet for political
huh.
reasons, very specific political reasons. And I ended up working in his garage as a kind of
Wow.
editorial director. I helped with his archive because he has a huge collection of art as well. I helped him write several catalogs, worked on exhibitions with him in Chicago. And at the time, he was at the Norton Simon in Pasadena. And
Mm,
it was with him that I not only got to then work within a museum setting, but then he very, very kindly, very generously um, said, "Okay, well, you have to curate a show of these works that I have for the Fowler."
mm,
And he had given a major gift to the museum, and I became the curator of those works. And so that became my
okay.
first book, which is the title of which was
Right.
not my choice, but the exhibition certainly and the writing certainly was.
I mean, the reason that I ask that is because as somebody who is deeply interested in the curatorial process and the idea and interested in design and the design process and is interested in, writing and sort of the theoretical side of this, curating seems like a really interesting way to bring all of those together, and that you're not just writing a text, but you are also working with objects and thinking about the sort of narrative, as you move through a space. And I'm kind of curious about this move from or transition between writing to curating, where suddenly you were working with actual objects and kind of thinking about how to make an argument with those objects in space. I ask this question to every curator that I talk to, but how can you talk a little bit about that process, or sort of that move from the written word to kind of making an argument in space?
Absolutely. I would say that writing is an essential component to the process, in as much as first being analytical. So I
Mm-hmm.
think one has to be extremely familiar with the works or objects that one is working with in order to assess the why. Why are we assembling these things together in the first place? I think then you also have to be able to write about a kind of reflective, in process set of ideas around, again, why and how. How are we
Mm-hmm.
imagining these narratives, these questions, these contexts through which to understand this assembly of objects or works? And then kind of ultimately, over time, you have the ability or capacity to directly respond to the making of the exhibition, to the structuring of an exhibition. And as you
Right.
say, like, what does it mean to move through space with these objects and works in confrontation with each other, in
Mm-hmm.
relationship to you as a viewer, as a
Mm-hmm.
body. And what really, I think, became revelatory for me was that in each kind of phase, if you will, writing took on different value, took on different meaning, and different
Mm-hmm.
importance. So you could, for instance, at MoMA, you could write an object report about something that you were planning to acquire or planning to show. Those reports go into a database that are kept, but that writing rarely gets seen unless it's a kind of
Right.
archival, you're recovering writing about that object. Um, but more of the writing that I was doing was wall labels,
Mm-hmm.
section texts, which are very hard to
Yeah.
to construct.
Yeah.
And then I think I found more excitement, if you will, more potential in that last part, the reflective part of writing, in which uh, you had already decided on what was coming together. You had already or one had already imagined what this exhibition would look like or act like,
Mm-hmm.
and it was maybe not a fait accompli, but it existed as a more holistic idea that may or may not have reflected the very first set of questions you asked or one asked.
I have a couple questions about MoMA. I want to make sure we talk about your new job
No
also, but I do
worries,
have a
of
couple
course.
questions. I do have a couple questions about your time at MoMA. One of your early shows there, might have been your first, was on displacement, insecurities, tracing displacement and shelter,
Yeah.
kind of about. And then you did a show that I think was the first show of yours that I saw, which was Thinking Machines: Art and Design in the Computer Age. And then obviously this past year, you worked with Mabel O. Wilson on the Reconstruction show.
Mhm.
I'm amongst many other things that you were doing at MoMA, but those were kind of the three big ones that I
Mhm.
had some connection to, or at least was familiar with. I'm What I'm interested in is, if you had, during your tenure there, did you have a sort of kind of curatorial project or mandate or goal, whether that was set by the institution or by yourself, that you wanted to work on, or kind of at a post like MoMA with an audience like that? What were the things you were really interested in kind of communicating or bringing to the fore? What was your sort of kind of big project there that kind of contain all of these other things?
Ostensibly, my role as an associate curator in the Department of Architecture and Design was first to be a contemporary looking or looking at the
Mm,
contemporary
mm,
moment or moments. Um, but that was really the only kind of parameters with which I were given. And
mm,
I I knew going in that I had to be open to any and all possibilities. And in fact, that kind of letting go of preconceived ideas of what MoMA was or could be was incredibly important. So I came to the institution with two sets of ideas. The first being that any contemporary any contemporary exhibitions that could or should be made should speak to the moment, but be speaking also to the future. Um,
mm.
and so my work on refugees, on displacement, had been the core of what I did in Australia. It was the main gambit of my writing, my research, both independent and with a colleague there named Jennifer Fern. And it was a project that, or a set of projects that came out of the horrific practices that are still going on, by the way, by the Australian government against asylum seekers. That
Mm,
architecture and say the built environment are deeply implicated by ideas
right.
around transience, around displacement, around refugee and humanitarian crises throughout the world. This is very problematic for an institution like I worked at Sydney because it spoke to the government, it spoke to political practices that were very much at the fore. But because I'm an American citizen, I was able to visit places like Nauru
Mm,
and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. I could go to Christmas Island. I could go and see these places that were built specifically to imprison asylum seekers and refugees,
mm,
and it was really the height of a moment in Australian politics in which these ideas were coming forward, but Australian citizens were not allowed to see these places. So
mm,
I felt very much, and I still do, that a curator should be a curator of architecture in particular should see the spaces, the projects,
right.
the works, the objects, the buildings, uh, as a means to communicate in an exhibition space. So anyway,
Hmm.
I brought that project or that I set of ideas with me, and it was in the very first meeting I had. Uh, I was asked to present an exhibition idea, and
Mm,
that then became Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter. And it happened over the course of around 7 months, very, very short period of time, not
wow.
only to
Wow.
learn
Yeah.
about museum practices, but also to put together an exhibition for which there was nothing in the collection or very little in the collection that could speak to it, right? Um,
Hmm.
so I think with the making of that exhibition, what I was starting to see was that if you asked these kinds of questions in a public realm such as MoMA, you could in effect change, hopefully, at any
Hmm.
scale in other realms. And what I saw, I think, with the opening of that exhibition was this desire among architecture schools in particular to start thinking about the place of humanitarian design or the efficacy of humanitarian
Right.
design in the space of architectural practice. Um, but that, and I think it speaks to human rights. I think it speaks
Yeah.
to questions of land, of borders, of sovereignty,
Hmm.
of nationhood, and so forth. These are all part, I think, of at that moment were part of a broader set of ideas that I was very keen to explore, but in other realms and in other time periods as well. So I've never felt bound um, to this contemporary idea, but unfortunately, because of the organization of the museum, it was in a way all that I was allowed to look at. Yet, when at the same time that I was finishing with my brilliant colleague Ariel Dion-Prosnik in Securities, it was both of our first exhibitions. Um, I started working on thinking machines um, again with another brilliant colleague at the time, Giampaolo Bianconi. And here it was a moment where I said that art, architecture, and design could be in the same space, and that they could speak to each other, and that they could have equal value um, intellectually, critically, and visually in the space of the gallery. And I think I think all along, and this is also at the same time that I'm also organizing the Young Architects program. So as the sole liaison between these practicing architects and these constructions, so I had this amazing opportunity to really um, challenge my skill set and work in as expansive a view of the world as possible. Thinking Machines was wonderful. It was, and both Insecurities and Thinking Machines were wonderful experiences. Again, because of the writing required, and
Mm.
also the ability to interface with thinkers, artists, scholars, architects, designers, so forth, who, in and of themselves, I think had long been challenging the paradigms of the disciplines in which they worked. So for Thinking
Right.
Machines, I had the great privilege of working with Tomiko Thiel, who was the principal designer of the Connection Machine.
Mm.
And she, along with a large group of scientists and designers, came up with this magnificent, huge hard drive, which at the time was being sold in the world as this supercomputer, right? And
Right. Right.
it's a beautiful machine. But also, I think for myself, I don't want to speak for Giampaolo, but for myself, it represented this idea that maybe we are all thinking machines, or that architects, in and of themselves and their practices, start to emulate or are emulated by the machines with which they are working today. So that exhibition ended kind of chronologically, I would say, in the 80s. But I would argue that it's and much of the content of that exhibition speaks to where we are today with the digital and the role of
Yeah, for
computers
sure.
in our world.
I remember seeing that show and just loving that one, by the way.
Thank
I'm
you.
you said something in there that I'm interested in, and this is a perhaps kind of peculiar question. um, I'm it's interesting, especially thinking about you working on the Young Architects program and kind of this focus, even if it's a loose focus on the contemporary. And I assume with a mandate like that, there's a certain kind of, having to kind of have your head up and be aware of kind of what's going on in the profession at the moment, in the field at the moment, in the world at the moment, kind of have your finger on the pulse of the issues that people are talking about, the big ideas that are animating architecture and design, and that in some ways might be counter to or attention with your deep historical background and spending time in archives and museums and kind of going deep on very specific subjects, and even like working on a show like Reconstructions while also working on young architects. This sort of balance between the history and the deep thinking and the writing with also the kind of gaze outward of like, okay, what's going on, what's everybody talking about. Was that true? Was it like that? And if it was, how did you kind of think about both of those sort of time scales?
Right. Well, I like to think on multiple time scales. I
Mm.
find solace in thinking about multiple time scales, and perhaps that gets me in trouble sometimes, not only in my exhibitions or in my writing, but also, it it begs the question today of how we think about our relationship to the world and in its inverse. And I would say, I think with your prior question, uh, the other mandate that I made for myself coming to MoMA was to look at its absences, to look at
Mm.
what had been overlooked in terms of larger questions around who is making architecture and where is
Right.
architecture. And I had by the time that I had come to MoMA, I had lived on 6 continents and worked on six continents and in various capacities, but suddenly realized that there were so many absences in the narratives that MoMA as an institution and as the first collection of architecture and design, of modern architecture and design, uh, hadn't bothered to consider. Or
Mm.
if they had, it certainly wasn't present in its exhibition histories. Um, so, this idea of absence, I think, is again very present in the ways in which I was thinking and trying to articulate, even with insecurities. If you look at the artists and the architects and designers who are in that exhibition, by and large, they are non Western. By and large, they
Mm-hmm.
come from backgrounds that they themselves, like Tiffany Chung, was a refugee herself. Rina Kalat is not a refugee, but is a South Asian, Indian born artist, but looking at the histories of
Mm-hmm.
migration and displacement in India and in South Asia. So it was incredibly important for me to register these absences in different ways. Now,
Mm.
at the time I was at the museum was also great upheaval in terms of the previous president and
Mm-hmm.
the so-called Muslim ban. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, I think it was quite remarkable for the institution to come together and then make these insertions into the permanent collection galleries of artists and architects like Zaha um, that emulated or replicated the Muslim ban. And or I don't know if it was called the Muslim ban. It was the ban on countries
Right. Right. Right.
predominantly
Right.
of Muslim origin, I should say. Um, so, in thinking about and trying to understand these absences, you could potentially, or I tried to potentially look at what and who had been left out of contemporary practice, architectural
Mm.
practice. And what was happening, I saw was not only a turn toward formalism, a different kind of formalism, a
Mm,
different kind of registration of materiality. But in that, what I wasn't seeing at all was the emergence of, or the embrace of African American and Black practitioners, as well as African based practitioners. And I, I think in my third year at the museum, I decided I was going to go and have a conversation with David Adjaye. And
mm,
uh, David and I have become, I think, fairly close friends, and we talk quite a bit. And what I was seeing, not only in his work, but in then people working on the African continent, was this, on one hand, desire for visibility, but at the same
mm,
time, a rejection or at least a reluctance to be
mm-hmm.
visible in the systems that had been created
Right,
by
right.
Western European and American ideas. I
Mm-hmm.
should say here that my PhD is in African art and
Right, right.
architecture, and so the continent is very close in my thinking, and it is in so much of my work, both in West Africa as well as East Africa and North Africa, has really become the impetus for um, you know, understanding visibility on one hand, and also the desire to make invisible. And I say
Mm,
this uh, not only in the context of the long arc of colonialism, which I still think much of the world is dealing with,
mm,
but
mm-hmm.
also with those systems that begin to frame and reframe who it is that and what it is that we see in the world.
Right,
Um,
right.
I'm not sure, Jared, if this answers your question, but I think that that is very much background to then the projects that we were working collaboratively on for the reopening of the museum in 2019.
Right.
And in that sense, I learned a great deal from my colleagues in other departments who,
Mm,
I think, in recognizing absence, had a greater flexibility and capacity to show works from these artists, from these locations that the architecture and design department hadn't ever made.
in a way, it sets up part of what my next question. I want to talk about your new job because you left MoMA at the beginning of the year and
Yeah.
you're back at Cornell. Teaching director of the architecture program there.
Yeah.
I have two questions, kind of immediately. A, why do you want to go back to academia? And B, how does the work that you were doing at MoMA, how do you see that continuing in this new position and in this kind of new space and kind of, taking it out of the museum back into academia? Do you see a way to kind of continue a lot of this thinking?
Well, I will be very honest with you and say that I had no intention to return to academia.
Mm,
As much as
okay.
I always loved teaching and being around students, and I was teaching also while I was working at MoMA, which is a
Mhm,
great privilege to be able to
mhm,
share the museum and to create educational programs with my brilliant colleagues in the education department there, two of which I'm still very much a part of, two free online courses
oh, right.
that are, I find great pleasure and honor to, and I'm humbled when I hear that so many people are able to take those courses and are learning from those courses and are able to rethink their own position um, in whatever field they are by virtue of those courses. So
Mhm.
So this transition back to academia, if you will, has been it's been rough. I've been because I loved working at MoMA, but I had to voluntarily leave. It had become an untenable situation, especially around our work with Reconstructions. And
Mm.
Mabel and I talk about it quite frequently, uh, about not only was there a profound lack of support, I think, for our exhibition, but
Mhm.
the more that we have talked about it, it challenged the very core of the modern project, and
Right. Right.
even without us saying it, right? Even without us
Yeah.
being overt about this 92-year absence of Black architects and architecture in the museum, even without our saying it, the exhibition said it, and I think
Yeah.
that many in the leadership, that suggested we were trying to undermine the museum, and that is absolutely not the case. Of course, the exhibition also came at a time when the Strike MoMA protests were happening,
Mhm.
and I think we were, you know, kind of arbitrarily placed in that same kind of reactive
Right.
realm,
Right.
which again, just to make the case here, we were never part of and had any intersection with. So
Mhm.
I found that, and I am still kind of grappling with it. Actually, is this the
Mhm.
multiple failures of the institution to support that exhibition, to think about the role of that exhibition in the department's future, in the museum's future, and so forth. So it really started to force me to come to terms with: do I stay in a place that I love, and that I have many colleagues whom I love and love working with, or do I then leave and try to strengthen, amplify, and build upon the
Mm.
questions that we
Yeah.
tried to do with Reconstructions. And so that's where I am. I feel like, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, about this role of administration versus, say, scholarship.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm in an administrative role, yes, and it's a kind of, again, a profound privilege to come back to the United States, having tried for years to work in an educational institution, on a permanent basis, I should say, while also having learned so much from all of these previous roles that I've had in the world. And
Yeah.
what I see right now is the effects of the pandemic very
Mhm.
much weighing heavily on our first and second year, and even our third year students, but all students.
Mm.
And I
Mhm.
think we have to work, um, all institutions should work with ideas of generosity, intellectual
Mhm.
generosity, but also just a degree of compassion, with a group of students and with a group of people, all of us, who have been profoundly affected uh, by the pandemic, by this virus. But it also, I think, what the pandemic has brought forward, it certainly did for me and others in MoMA, was a kind of X-ray moment. Suddenly, we could see institutions for what they have been and what they are, and the frailties that all institutions, all forms of instruction or education, um, are at a moment when we as a society, as communities, as individuals are being questioned.
Mm.
And what's remarkable about Cornell right now, because I'm part of several searches, and I was also part of a search that allowed me to come to Ithaca, um, was and is again this return to who is it that we imagine being architects, and that
Right.
who is so crucial to not only the architects, the practitioners that we eventually will send out into the world, but also to ask ourselves, like, who are we to, or at least I'm asking myself, who am I to ask these questions of students and faculty alike? It's an incredible privilege to be in this position that on one hand, you are forecasting and structuring and imagining a future curriculum, ways of working through pedagogy. Um, it's almost as if we are, uh, we're in the proto phase of a future
Yeah.
exhibition, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
see it as like laying the groundwork for future practice. And in that regard, I would say it's a great pleasure but a huge challenge to kind of not only I wouldn't say retrace my steps, but to ask questions that are almost adjacent to the questions that I was asking uh,
Mm-hmm.
at the museum. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and what I would say, just in regard to exhibition making, is exhibitions are ephemeral. They are designed, they are built, they are considered, they are then made, observed, experienced, and then they disappear.
Right.
And what we have the ability to do, or what we had the ability to do at the museum, is to say, what is the afterlife of an exhibition like Reconstructions?
Mm.
And for that, will always be humbled and always be profoundly just impressed, for lack of a better word, um, by the formation of the Black Reconstruction Collective. And the work
Mm-hmm.
that they will do and continue to do as a space of advocacy, as a space of thinking, but also of this kind of precarious, if you will, visibility. Uh, and so, what I
Right.
advocate for students is, first of all, to not take these paradigms, to not take these structures as a given, and
Mm-hmm.
to challenge themselves and to challenge the work that they are doing and that they hope to do, um, has not, that there are no solutions per se in architecture right
Mm.
now, but
Right.
there are
Right.
really remarkable ways that communities, that individuals are thinking around the world about what architecture is and what architecture can mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Sean, you set up like a dozen other questions that I could could ask you now from that, but I think that's a really nice
Please, please.
it's a really nice way to wrap this up. So I'm going to ask you the last question that I used to end all of these. I'm just curious what you're reading right now.
you know, I have to relearn how to read, and I've said this for quite some time. At MoMA, I was reading more literature rather than
Hmm.
history because I found that the narratives and the spaces that are constructed and imagined in literature are far more profound than those often that that scholarship can indicate or criticism can indicate. I'm not disparaging scholarship or criticism in that regard, but
Right.
you know, in preparation for Reconstructions, which happened over 3.5 years, I was reading quite a bit of literature, and I was reading. I profoundly influenced by writing by Saidiya Hartman, by Toni Morrison. Toni, in fact, was to write the foreword for our exhibition book, our field guide, and then, of course, passed away,
Right.
unfortunately. And but I was reading also a lot of historical discourses that don't necessarily speak to architecture, because at the time that we were preparing the exhibition, there were very few. So you have to look to alternative sources. You have to look to other ways of imagining and thinking to inform what it is that we're what we're hoping to ask to make. So what am I reading right now? I am reading, if I were to look at my desk as I speak, because I'm writing 2 essays right now for 2 artists who I profoundly admire. I am looking at Sufi texts from the 18th century. I am looking at old Deleuze, if you can imagine that, and I am not a huge fan. And I am reading Borges.
Wow. That's a good collection, though. That's a nice mix. It sounds like you're doing a good job relearning how to read.
Well, it's hard. It's hard. And I would love to say that I could put away email for a few hours every day and just read. And that is my ambition.
You and me both.
So I would just say, too, that I read not only for trying to imagine new spaces. And I've always wanted to also write fiction, by the way. And
interesting.
People like Leslie Locke, also a dear friend and mentor, and Mabel, both of whom write fiction, as this practice, this parallel practice for thinking about the possible, thinking about the potential, is really of great interest to me. So maybe I will sit down and write a novel one day.
I love that. When you do, we should continue this conversation. I feel like there's so much more I could talk to you about. I enjoyed this so much.
I would love to.
Sean, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Jarrett. I would love to return one day.
This episode was recorded on October 29th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Bargasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.